All right, welcome. Uh, hope can hear me. Sound should be coming through. Um, yeah. Okay, so this live going to be talking about the neuroscience of decision making and specifically the role of value in that process, valuation. So I'm just going to jump into this, kind of start with sort of a hypothetical story. Um, and okay, so let's imagine you and I are going out to lunch, right? And we're deciding between Mexican food and pizza, right? You're leaning toward Mexican food, and a region of your brain, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, reflects this preference. So it increases its activity more when you think about Mexican food compared to pizza, right? If I could see your brain's activity, I could use this one region to predict if to predict your choice with considerable accuracy. But that is really just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, this region I just mentioned, which I'll just point it out on this diagram, is right here, uh, right in there. This region, kind of behind your forehead, near the midline of the brain. If you're listening to this, um, but it is just one node in a network of brain regions that allow us to make decisions. Um, but it's a really important one, and we'll talk about why in a moment. So this is especially true when it comes to more complex decisions. There's a lot of brain activity going on in complex decisions, like whether to have kids or change your career. But even in a trivial decision like where to eat for lunch, your brain has to compare two completely different concepts and somehow measure them on a common scale, right? And that is a difficult problem to think about. How does that actually work? How do we get to um, comparing things that are so different on a common scale, right? And you're probably not even aware of all the factors that go into your decisions, right? So there's factors like taste and nutrition and all these different things that have to go into this decision, and these are very different. And somehow all of this fuses together into a simple preference, reflected in the degree of the activation of the vmPFC. Well, there. Huh. So this video will explain the role of valuation in the neuroscience of decision making and the related field of neuroeconomics. But most importantly, by the end, we will see how you can take control of these brain processes to make better decisions in your own life. Because your decisions rule your life, right? Your circumstances matter, of course, and your development, your genes, your environment, all of that matters. But whatever control you have over your life is found in the decisions you make, right? So it's important to understand this process and to get some insight into it. And to begin, I just want to clarify a couple terms I've mentioned already: decision neuroscience and neuroeconomics. So, decision neuroscience is a field that seeks to map the brain's pathways and mechanisms that underlie our decisions. Neuroeconomics, on the other hand, is a really closely related term. It's sometimes used interchangeably with decision neuroscience, but there are some scientists who define it more narrowly as like the branch of decision neuroscience concerned with choices involving costs and benefits of actions, especially involving money. Um, so to better understand these fields, I want to focus in on one piece of decision making, which is valuation, this role of value. And we're going to talk first about what's called a common currency value signal. So this brings us back to the idea of weighing disparate values, different aspects of each option you have before you in a sort of common currency. So the key to understanding this concept is to just think about the role of currency in the economy, right? So a particular currency like the US dollar can be thought of as a way of directly comparing the values of various goods. So, for example, you walk through the grocery store, you see thousands of items. They're all priced in terms of how many dollars you have to pay for them. They're not priced in terms of some kind of like, how many coffee mugs you need to give up to get this thing. Or we don't live in a barter economy. We live in an economy with a single currency. But the brain also seems to use a unified currency to directly compare choices in terms of their value to you. So, for example, consider the choice between an apple and a candy bar, really similar to the kind of Mexican food pizza idea, but picture an apple and a candy bar, right? These are pretty different things. The apple offers health benefits, right? Obviously, but it might not be quite as satisfying taste-wise if you have a really strong sweet tooth. And the candy bar might provide instant pleasure, but it's not as healthy, right? The brain converts these very different values, right? This long term expectation of, oh, eating this apple might be better for my health in the long run versus the immediate pleasure of, I love this, Snickers bar, the immediate pleasure. It has to convert these different values into some kind of common neural currency, allowing us to make that decision. And so there are a number of brain areas that are involved in this process. And I already mentioned kind of the star of the show, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. But I'm also going to outline the role of a couple different other brain regions that are really important for this. So first, the ventral striatum and the anterior cingulate cortex are the two I'm really going to focus on. And to give you a sense, I pointed out where the vmPFC is in this diagram. It's right here, right in this area. Now, the anterior cingulate cortex is this strip of tissue just above that white area there. So it's this part of the cortex that's kind of underneath the rest of the cortex. And so you can see those are really close nearby regions, and they have really they're like functionally overlapping and also anatomically really close to each other. And so just first off, the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, this is a brain region. I've done a whole episode on the ACC, a whole video, which you can find on my channel, linked in the description of this video. But the ACC assesses kind of the value of different options. It plays a role in that process by calculating their potential risks and rewards. It does a lot of other stuff, and you can see that by I think it was about an hour-long video I did on the ACC. But just to sort of summarize that all in a couple of sentences, it involves the prediction of future outcomes based on past experiences and recent observations. And different regions within the ACC represent aspects, like average value over a long run, the recent value of something, and this aids in the assessment of these potential outcomes. So the ACC, if you want to know more about that process, check out that video. It's hard to summarize all that into a short, soundbite there, but it has a lot of roles in complex decision making, especially under uncertainty. But that's kind of an aside, because the second most important region outside of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the second most important region is the ventral striatum. And the ventral striatum is part of the brain's dopaminergic reward prediction error system, which I've talked about in other videos. But the ventral striatum is really involved in kind of anticipating future rewards. It's part of the system that is involved in tracking rewards and predicting future rewards. And so it is you can kind of think of it as being this area that is really important for tracking kind of more immediate pleasures, stuff that is just has some kind of reward in the sort of immediate future. It activates in response to those kinds of things. And I'm mentioning that because the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, in addition to being capable of its activity being capable of predicting what choice we're actually going to make, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex has been shown to be very important in understanding our own personal values, what we really value in not just the short term, not just these immediate pleasures and rewards, but in the long term as well. It integrates those values, and we could get into a discussion of all the different regions that are involved in this process of determining value and integrating it into the vmPFC. But it is kind of enough to understand that the value signal is integrated in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And so, in other words, the vmPFC is where our brain's calculation of how much we value a particular option overall is ultimately represented. Now, of course, the choice between an apple and a candy bar, even this very simple choice, involves a lot more than just the assessment of taste and health effects, right? You might be just starting your day and the thought of it like a candy bar for breakfast sounds disgusting. Or perhaps you got off work and you want to reward yourself with a candy bar and it sounds good. Or maybe you're allergic to peanuts that are in the candy bar. Maybe you hate the texture of, apples on the other hand. Maybe you're not concerned with the health effects, but rather the sugar rush or something. My point here is there are many considerations that need to be taken into account before our brains can calculate the overall value of each option. And so that's where this idea of separate value signals come in. And this is where I'm going to discuss another brain region, also really close to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, called the orbitofrontal cortex. And it's called orbitofrontal cortex because it's just behind the orbits of the eyes. It's just behind your eyes, essentially. And it actually sort of surrounds the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And there's in this area of kind of these neuroanatomical designations, there is actually a lot of disagreement on what constitutes the boundaries between these regions that we're talking about. So the reality is we're talking about, I'll just point it out on this diagram again. So see, in this image, you are seeing the brain from the underside. And we're really talking about kind of this medial frontal portion of the cortex here. And just that, I think, is enough to get an intuition for what we're talking about. But the orbital frontal cortex kind of acts like the compare feature on e-commerce sites. So if you're on like Amazon.com and you're looking at the two different things you might buy, two different phones, let's say, right? And you're looking at the different aspects of each of those. They've got different cameras, different memory, different processors, and you are trying to compare their different features. You can use that compare feature to line them up next to each other and see, okay, which kind of camera does this one have? Which kind of processor does this one have? And then assign values to each of those before making a purchase. And so let me just explain what I mean by the orbital frontal cortex kind of acting in that way. It is weighing positive sensory feelings against negative ones. So the OFC, the orbital frontal cortex, is helping to evaluate what you like and what you don't like, which is really important in guiding your ultimate decision. And the OFC kind of evaluates sensory data. So, like, for example, if you say you hate spicy foods, but you like the taste of bell peppers, right? Then if you eat a jalapeno, right? Jalapeno is very spicy, but it's also kind of tastes like a bell pepper. So the OFC might process those different aspects of the jalapeno separately. So process kind of the spiciness. Okay, this is a painful, negative sensory perception, and then the flavor that you like as kind of, okay, this is positive. So there is this ability of different populations of neurons in the orbital frontal cortex to activate in response to these various sensory attributes of food in this case. And damage to the orbital frontal cortex, but so damage to orbital frontal or ventral medial frontal cortex um, can result in decision-making deficits with it, makes it more difficult for people to make decisions based on punishments and rewards, among other things. But basically, there are these different clusters of neurons in the OFC that can encode values for like taste and texture and even the health benefit, or as not health benefits, but the sensory aspects of the food individually. But ultimately, I want to come back to this idea of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex integrating all of these values. The vmPFC is ultimately where these attributes are integrated and represented as an overall value of each option. And I'm talking about the orbital frontal cortex processing these individual aspects of the sensory aspects of the food, but that is kind of a stand-in to talk about there are other brain regions that are involved in uh, different aspects of the overall decision. So, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a different area of the prefrontal cortex, is involved in the health benefits that we were talking about with the apple versus the candy bar. So, it is going to recognize, or it is going to activate to consider, okay, the apple has more health benefits than the candy bar. And critically, if that matters to you, if you actually care about the nutritional quality of the food, it's going to send that information to be integrated by the vmPFC into an overall value of that option. So I hope that makes sense, that I'm simplifying this. There's more going on here. The hippocampus, the amygdala, different regions of the brain are involved in determining individual um, the value of individual aspects of our choices. But the vmPFC and the ventral striatum, to some extent, are really where this value signal comes to a head, where it is ultimately calculated. And I hope that makes sense. But there's an interesting thing that I came across while doing this research that I think it may seem slightly out of place right here, but later on, it will help us to develop some of these strategies for making better decisions um, by understanding this. And so, going to kind of shift focus a little bit from talking about how we evaluate options to what happens when we make a choice. And there's this finding that suggests that it's not just the options themselves that influence our brain's sort of value system. It is also the act of choosing. So, in making a choice, we amplify the activation of the ventral striatum and the vmPFC. Now, again, I'm simplifying this. There's more nuance to this in the findings, but this suggests that making a decision is valuable in itself. And I think this helps explain why we often feel so uncomfortable when we can't decide on an important choice. There's a certain kind of relief that comes when we finally settle on one option or another. Once we decide, it just feels much better. So this brings us to another part of this decision making process. So when it comes to our most consequential decisions, like what career to pursue or whether to start a family, right? These really big life decisions, we spend a long time poring over our reasons for each of the options that are available to us. We're kind of like detectives or scientists searching for the evidence that will tell us the right answer. This search for evidence can be described by certain mathematical models that are applied to decision making. And the one we're going to talk a little bit about is the Drift-Diffusion Model, or DDM. And I'll be honest, I'm not a computational neuroscientist, far from it. I am explaining this on an intuitive level as I understand it. So I apologize if I'm making any mistakes here, but from the science that I've read on this, I understand that the DDM, the drift diffusion model, is a mathematical model that visualizes decision making as an accumulation of evidence over time. So as we gather more information, our brain's valuation processes lean toward one choice until a decision threshold is reached, at which point we make that decision. So let's consider an example, right? Let's go back to those smartphones that you're buying on the e-commerce site, right? On Amazon. You're looking to buy a new smartphone, but you're deciding between an iPhone and a Samsung Galaxy. To help you decide, right, you read an article comparing the two phones. You first read that the Galaxy has a better camera, but then that the iPhone has better security features. And that's actually true. Well, according to one article I read. You continue reading, and at the same time, consider the prices and the features, right, that do and do not matter to you. So you're considering all this about the phones, the various features, not just the camera, not just the security features, the processor, the thickness of the phone, all the things that matter to you. And at some point, a winner emerges, right? You decide to buy the upgraded model of the smartphone you originally had because, after all, the accumulated evidence supports your decision. And notice I didn't take a stance on the iPhone versus Galaxy debate. But anyway, during this decision, a region in your brain called the posterior medial frontal cortex. So again, we're still talking about this medial frontal portion of the cortex. That medial referring to the midline, going down like the center of if you were to draw a line on the top of your head, going from the front to the back, that is kind of the midline of your skull. But then the frontal portion of the cortex. So we're talking about the posterior medial frontal cortex. So it's a lot of words there, but the point is that this area may be integrating the evidence involved in this choice between phones. The activity in this region has also been shown to couple, so to co-activate with the activity of the vmPFC and the ventral striatum, the two regions we've been talking about whose activity most closely represents your sense of how valuable something is to you. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of speculation here. I'm going to go outside of the evidence that is available and talk about what I think might be happening. So it may be that the activity in the posterior medial frontal cortex, this sort of threshold region, represents a kind of decision threshold, which when crossed, when enough evidence emerges for one option over the other, right? That's when the threshold is crossed. This region may then communicate that information to the vmPFC and the ventral striatum, essentially telling them that option A should be considered more valuable than option B, right? That's kind of an idea, might not be true, but what is true is this region, the posterior medial frontal cortex, seems to be integrating the evidence involved in this in your choice, right? Seems to have this role in this decision threshold. Now, there are other models of valuation in decision making, but I'm not going to go into these here. I just wanted to give us a kind of intuitive feel for how some of these models think about our decision making and how that relates to your everyday experiences. But as noted at the beginning of this video, there's a lot more to the neuroscience of decision making. I've been trying to make that point that I am simplifying this because I want to help us understand and identify some strategies for making better decisions and relating them to these brain mechanisms we've been talking about so that you can walk away with some tools for making better decisions. And if you're watching this and getting any kind of value from this, please give this video a like. It really helps this channel, and even consider hitting the subscribe button as well. That would be awesome. It really helps YouTube to understand that this is providing some kind of value to people. But let's look at 3 different strategies for decision making, some of which you may have heard before, but now we can kind of supplement them with some of this neuroscientific information. So the first one is to delay your decision and introduce a cooling off period. So we talked about there being a kind of a conflict sort of between the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, where the ventral striatum is more reactive to immediate rewards, and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is more attuned to our values and the sort of long-term value of something. We can kind of think of it that way. Again, simplifying. But our brain may, on average, kind of lean toward those immediate rewards. I think we can all kind of see that, especially when we're tired or we just don't have that ability to exert a kind of like cognitive control over that sense of I want that now. I want that immediate pleasure now, right? I want that shiny new object now. I want to buy the new phone. I want to buy these new shoes or whatever it is. And that can lead us to making some poor spending decisions, or it can lead into poor relationship decisions too. To overcome this, or to help to overcome this, you can introduce a cooling off period before making your decisions, right? Sleep on it. Sleep on that decision, especially when you feel like you're tempted by these immediate sort of pleasures, immediate gains. So for example, if you're buying a house or some other, significant purchase, something big, wait, right? And I think maybe even a better example than a house would be like an expensive watch or an expensive phone or something like that that looks really cool, and you're on the website, you're like, oh, maybe I want to get this right now. Wait, right? Wait some time, because by waiting and reflecting, that initial surge of excitement about the shiny new purchase kind of dissipates, right? And we can relate this back to the brain because the vmPFC, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is actually part of the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain's main cognitive control region. And so if you've watched my video on the prefrontal cortex, you know that it is really this brain region that's involved in kind of controlling the rest of the brain in some way. Well, it's part of a network, part of multiple networks that are involved in these executive functions, in delaying gratification, in planning, in emotion regulation. And so when you give yourself time to think, you give that cognitive control system better chance of helping you make a more balanced decision based on what your values really are, right? What your long-term, not just your short-term, pleasure and immediate gains, but those long-term values as well. Okay, so then moving on to another tool, another strategy for making better decisions. This is kind of a mouthful, but multifaceted evaluation. Does that sound sciencey enough? So earlier we highlighted the role of the orbitofrontal cortex in assessing these various aspects of a decision. Right? We emphasized that the brain can weigh different attributes separately before arriving at a judgment. To take maximum advantage of this process, or to really take advantage of it, when you're faced with a decision, list down the various attributes of each option and evaluate them separately. So this is when you're facing one of these really difficult, life-changing decisions. If you're going to change your whole career path, are you going to start a family? Are you going to ask someone to marry you? Are you going to do these big decisions that are going to change the course of your life or not? Or which one are you going to do? That is really hard to decide sometimes. So coming up with a list of the various attributes, like if you're choosing a job, think about, the salary, the location, the job role, the company culture, the growth opportunities, and think about which of those matter to you most, and kind of develop this hierarchy of values. And you can apply this to all sorts of big decisions like this. But the point is that by breaking this decision down, you reduce the risk of making a decision based on a superficial analysis of what you value. You make these pro-con lists, these cost-benefit analyses, and try to really get in touch with your own thinking, with your own values, and come up with, why one option has more than the other. Now, the problem with this is that when we're making difficult decisions, we can't find the perfect option. That's really rare, right? And this leads us to the third tool, and what I call hypothesize, act, observe, and repeat, or you can just think of it as just choose. We often go in circles in our minds. We analyze the available options and try to predict how each one will turn out far into the future, right? We try to think our way through these decisions that are really complex. And in doing so, we inevitably encounter trade-offs, right? Instances where option A is better than option B on one metric, but option B is better than A on another equally important metric, right? And so we make the pro-con lists. We go make those cost-benefit analyses I was just talking about. And this leaves us feeling unable to act because we just keep coming up empty-handed. We don't know what is really the right decision. We have this fear that we're going to make a terrible mistake, a life-altering mistake, and be right back at square one. And that is when you have entered into analysis paralysis. Analysis paralysis is uncomfortable, right? It can be like it can feel like no matter what you do, you're doomed, or it's just not going to be very good. But that's almost always an illusion. Sure, there are times when you're facing, legitimate like catch-22s where no option is a good option, but most of the time, analysis paralysis is a kind of illusion. But why is that? Because as we noted earlier, just making a decision can sometimes be a kind of reward, a kind of positive experience in itself, right? So after you do this careful analysis, sometimes the best thing to do is just choose. Maybe you flip a coin if you really aren't leaning toward one option or the other. And the neuroscientist David Eagleman, in one of his books, he notes that when you flip the coin and let's say it lands heads, right? And you have this sense like, I don't want to choose heads. Go with tails. That's what you should do. You should go with tails if you feel that inkling like, oh, this is wrong. Because that's something in you, that something in your brain's valuation system somewhere saying that is the wrong option. So anyway, that's kind of an aside. But the second reason that the analysis paralysis is a kind of illusion is that predicting the future in perfect detail is impossible. It's impossible to predict the future perfectly or even very accurately. Even your own future. We think we know ourselves more than we do. And the truth is that we often don't know how much we like or dislike something until we try it, right? The old saying, don't knock it until you try it. So after thinking through the pros and cons, sometimes it's better to make a reasonable hypothesis, act on it, observe what happens over time, then restart the cycle and improve incrementally on the next round. And I'll just talk about a personal example in this area. I am very into science, as you can tell. But when I started college, I went in as an English major, right? And I thought that was my path. I love writing. I still love writing. I like literature. I love books. I love reading. I love writing. But I started finding like this isn't really for me. And I had never been a science person. I had never in high school, I never did well in science. Um, I did okay. You know, I started kind of finding some interest in it, but I just never thought, oh, that's me. But then I took a chemistry course and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the problem solving, the logic of it, and I knew, okay, I got to go towards science. I got to go that way. And actually, I first chose a chemistry major because, of course, I really liked that class. But I soon found, okay, this also isn't really what I want. This isn't really the thing. And eventually I found biology, and that's what I did. And I got so into that, and I found, okay, if I hadn't have tried the chemistry course, if I hadn't have decided, okay, I'm just going to change my major to that, I would never have found molecular biology, and I would never have understood that really clicked with my brain. And now, over that time after that, I found, okay, molecular biology is still extremely interesting, still very cool, but neuroscience and psychology started calling me. And so I think that's just a personal example to show that sort of having this cycle of hypothesis, action, observation, and then restarting the cycle to make incremental improvement over time really can work for big decisions. And this relates to something in business where entrepreneurs will sometimes talk about what they call the minimum viable product and the importance of testing that product on the market in order to get customer feedback and make rapid improvements in this kind of virtuous cycle of product release, feedback, and improvement. So rather than trying to create the perfect product in one go, some entrepreneurs have the philosophy that you should focus on making something good and then make it better and better over time based on feedback, based on observation. And I believe you can apply that process, like I was saying in my own life, to many of your big decisions in life. So if you're thinking about changing your career, but you can't decide whether you should stay or go, first, you should think carefully about each option. You should do the kind of analysis, the first tool I mentioned, the first decision strategy, really thinking carefully, taking that cooling off period, doing this multifaceted evaluation. But if you reach that state of analysis paralysis, it's probably time to act. How do you do that? So you make a reasonable hypothesis in the form of a kind of if-then statement. If I change my career from surgery to welding, then I will enjoy my work more and be less stressed, even though I'll make less money. I'm totally making these examples up. If you have good reason to believe that this statement is likely to be true, if you really believe that, and you're honestly assessing what you value most in a career, then it's probably time to act on that hypothesis. Test it out, analyze the results, and then see what happens. Maybe set an amount of time. Whatever the result is, honestly assess if it had a positive, negative, or maybe no effect on these things that you hypothesized it would have an effect on. Will you be less stressed and make more, will enjoy your work more and be less stressed? Because that, even if it was just a small, tiny improvement, or if it was went in the wrong direction, it was a negative effect, that's valuable information that can help you improve your life on the next cycle. So anyway, those are kind of the strategies, and we've talked about some of the neuroscience, and again, just emphasizing we've simplified a lot of this. But I just wanted to give you kind of understanding of how your brain understand how it creates value, in the sense of how it determines the value of various options that you might be choosing among. And now I want to leave you with kind of a summary, right? Because we talked about a lot of different things. But first of all, I just want to thank the Patreon supporters who make this channel possible, because without you, it would be very difficult for me to justify the time I spend researching and making these kinds of videos. And this video you're watching, this was a Patreon only live stream. So patrons were given access to the live recording of this video. And if you want to have that access, and if you want written versions of all new videos and live streams like this one, go to patreon.com/senseofmind and see there's a couple different options for support, and you can choose how much you want to give per month. And that is just extremely valuable to this channel. And if you care about this channel, I really encourage you to think about becoming a Patreon supporter, or at least just hitting that subscribe button below. That also really helps. But without further ado, let's do a quick recap. So decision making involves the brain, obviously. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the vmPFC, this plays a key role. It's probably the most important region in reflecting our values, our preferences. The brain uses a common currency value signal to compare choices. It converts different values into a unified neural currency. A few other brain regions we talked about were the anterior cingulate cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, and the ventral striatum. And these all work together along with the vmPFC to facilitate value-based decision-making. The anterior cingulate analyzes potential long-term benefits and repercussions of choices. The ventral striatum focuses on immediate gratification. That's a simplification there, but the orbitofrontal cortex evaluates and assigns separate values to distinct attributes of a choice. And again, there are other regions that are involved, like the hippocampus. The hippocampus is involved in, especially when we're thinking about a past experience and integrating what we learned about the value of some option based on that past experience. Anyway, that's an aside, I'm sorry. But it all comes together in the vmPFC, representing this overall subjective value of an option. Making a choice, the act of deciding itself, can amplify the neural valuation process and increase our sense of reward. It has a positive effect. We talked about the Drift-Diffusion Model as a mathematical model that visualizes decision-making as an accumulation of evidence over time. And then we jumped into these tools for making better decisions. So the first one was to delay your choice, introducing a cooling off period before decisions that allow you to make a more balanced decision, allow you to really tap into what are my personal values rather than what's the shiny object that I might want right now. Second tool was multifaceted evaluation, making those pro-con lists to assess different attributes of options separately for informed decisions, really elaborating on that process that the OFC, the orbitofrontal cortex, kind of already does in the sensory domain. And then finally, hypothesize, act, observe, and repeat. Avoid analysis paralysis by making reasonable hypotheses, acting on them, observing the results, and iterating that process, making incremental improvements over time, allowing you to not get stuck in that trap of analysis paralysis and to make better decisions over time. So anyway, I hope this video provided some value to you. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe. Thank you for being here. I'm Andrew Cooper Sansone. This is Sense of Mind, and I'll catch you next time.